Back in 1991, Mitsubishi introduced a new 2+2 sports coupe in their home market of Japan, the GTO, and marketed it globally as the 3000 GT. Their partnership with Chrysler gave the US and Canada a Dodge version of the same car, the Stealth. Despite being offered with a 300 horsepower twin-turbo V6 on top-end models, they were offset by much cheaper and slower base models, too many competitors, and a declining market that forced production to end by 1999, making them a rare find today. This is a story of the Dodge Stealth and Mitsubishi 3000 GT. This is my old car.
Warning. The Dodge Stealth is not invisible to radar.
Thanks to all of you who suggested I do an episode on these cars, and to those who contributed to my poll on my community page to pick the next Mitsubishi Chrysler mashup to review. Admittedly, I was happy to see the Stealth and 3000 GT win the poll, as I seriously wanted a Stealth back in the 90s, but ultimately didn't buy one, for reasons I will explain later. Many others have asked for an episode on their predecessors, the Mitsubishi Starion and the twin Chrysler Conquest, which I plan to do in a later episode. Unless you live in Japan, you may have never seen the version of this car as it was sold in its home market, where it was called the GTO. Mitsubishi had used that name before as a trim level on their Galant model from the 1970s. And the name GTO was in turn borrowed from the 1962 to 64 Ferrari 250 GTO. GTO stood for Gran Turismo Omologata, referring to the car being a homologation, a production car that meets specific racing regulations. Those in America are much more familiar with the GTO name on Pontiac muscle cars of the 60s and 70s, and a short revival in the mid-2000s as a rebadged Holden Monero, imported from Australia. Considering how well known the GTO name was already associated with Pontiac in America, and with Ferrari almost everywhere else, Mitsubishi definitely couldn't export this car with the GTO name.
Mitsubishi GTO.
So the company held an internal contest to pick a new name, which became the 3000 GT. If anyone has some inside info on what the 3000 in the name was supposed to signify, please share in the comments, as that is one fact I've always been curious about, but haven't been able to uncover.
The Mitsubishi 3000 GT, import car of the year.
By 1991, Mitsubishi already had several years behind them of selling cars in the United States, although many of those years saw their cars only available as rebadged Dodges, Plymouths, or Chryslers, thanks to Chrysler's majority stake in Mitsubishi back then. However, by 1982, Mitsubishi started exporting cars to the US under their own name, eventually leading to the 3000 GT, which shared a chassis design with the Mitsubishi Eclipse. Maybe because of that connection to the Eclipse, although probably more likely because the 3000 GT had a Dodge sibling, they are sometimes incorrectly referred to as DSM cars, the acronym for Diamond Star Motors, which I detail in an episode I did earlier for DSM. The Mitsubishi Eclipse, along with its Chrysler siblings, the Plymouth Laser and Eagle Talon, were the original DSM cars, built in the joint-owned DSM factory in Normal, Illinois. Only cars built in the DSM factory were DSM cars. The 3000 GT and Stealth, on the other hand, were imports from Japan. When the Mitsubishi GTO was being considered for export to the US and Canada, Chrysler wanted their own version for their Dodge division, as a step up from their Dodge Daytona, and as a replacement for the Mitsubishi Starion twin, the Conquest, which had also been marketed under Chrysler and Plymouth. As part of the deal, Dodge's version would have all the same Mitsubishi mechanicals, but have its own unique styling and trim options. Dodge named their version the Stealth, a name that my much younger self thought was way cool back then, and was a much better name, in my opinion, than 3000 GT. Dodge wanted to promote the car by having it be the pace car of the 1991 Indianapolis 500, but when the United Auto Workers learned of the plan, they nixed it, as they didn't want a Japanese-built car promoting a race as distinctly American as the Indy 500. A prototype of the 1992 Dodge Viper filled in as the pace car for the actual race. However, some pace car replicas of the Stealth were still produced for public sale. To help bring in more potential customers, Dodge offered a base version of the Stealth that had a less powerful engine than both the 3000 GT and GTO. Although all the Mitsubishi-designed V6 engines used in all three cars displays 3 liters, in the base Stealth it was a 12-valve single overhead cam that only made 164 horsepower. Initially, the 3000 GT didn't offer the same engine. Instead, its base model had a 24-valve double overhead cam that made 222 horsepower. You had to upgrade your Stealth to either the ES or RT trims to get that engine. The base model Stealth was clearly an attempt to increase the market share of the car, but in my opinion, it went way too far on the low end, and consequently, I think it hurt the overall image of the car. It was also one of the reasons I decided against it and would instead purchase my first Dodge, the Daytona, which I talk about in my Dodge Daytona episode. Although I couldn't afford the top-end IROC Z, the ES trim, which my car had, looked essentially the same as the IROC Z, except for badging. So to the untrained eye, which most people had, they figured I had the top-end model. Compare that to the base trim of the Dodge Stealth, which had significant visual differences from the higher-end models. The base model had body-colored headlight covers and roof, as opposed to black, a less aggressive chin spoiler, cheaper-looking gray plastic trim, and no rear spoiler, all of which just screamed base model. It even came standard with manual windows and locks. You had to pay extra for powered versions. But the biggest visual difference was the tail lamps and rear bumper, with a far less aggressive design on the base model. Upgrading to the Stealth RT model was a considerable change in the look of the car, now essentially looking the same as the RT Twin Turbo, minus the badging. But it was also a bump in price that made it more difficult to afford, at least for me back then. Although I found out later that any version of the car would have been a tight fit for me. I'm 6 foot tall, which really isn't that tall, but this car really wasn't well suited for taller drivers. The Mitsubishi 3000 GT, on the other hand, took a much different approach when it came to trim levels. Its base and SL trim started with a mid-range 222 horsepower engine, but visually looked the same, with just differences in options. And they also didn't really look any different than the top-end twin-turbo model, the VR4. Clearly the styling department for the 3000 GT believed their customer base didn't need all the visual differences among the trim levels, whereas Dodge did. The top-end models of both cars, the Stealth RT twin-turbo and the 3000 GT VR4, each got Mitsubishi's 3-liter double overhead cam twin-turbo, mated only to a 5-speed manual transmission. US and Canadian spec cars got the highest horsepower rating of 300, which although it matched the output of the Nissan 300ZX, it was a marked improvement over the Toyota Supra and Subaru SVX. But the twin-turbo RT and VR4 models were also heavy, weighing in at over 3,700 pounds, or almost 1,700 kilograms.
Stealth really smoking.
About 5% heavier than their competitors. European spec 3000 GT's horsepower ratings were slightly lower, at 282, but this kept the engine temperature lower, and that, along with an upgraded transmission, made them better suited for prolonged high speeds on the German Autobahn. The high-end versions of both cars also offered features that today would seem expected, but were unexpected on sports cars back in the 90s. Features such as full-time four-wheel drive and four-wheel steering, which, if over 35 miles per hour, would turn the rear axle by 1.5 degrees in the same direction as the front wheels, to provide more control in cornering. They also had automatically adjusting front and rear spoilers, an exhaust that could be adjusted to be either quiet or loud, and an electronically controlled suspension, or ECS, a feature which necessitated blister caps on the hood to accommodate it above the front shocks. Surprisingly, the lower-end models, which didn't have ECS, still had the same blister caps on the hood, which I suspect may have been a cost-saving measure to avoid producing two different hoods. Despite all the technological improvements, or maybe because of them, these Mitsubishi engines proved to be more of a liability over time. Unlike the comparable twin-turbo Toyota Supra, the Mitsubishi engines and transmissions were far more prone to breakdowns, often too expensive to fix or replace, which probably has contributed to why you see so few of these cars today. With so many Japanese sports car options in the early 90s, sales for the Stealth and 3000 GT started to slide by 1993, so a mid-cycle refresh was released for the 1994 model year. Gone were the pop-up headlamps, replaced with composite units on both, which a majority of fans actually preferred, since pop-ups certainly don't help the car's aerodynamics, and it was one less thing to break. The bulges to accommodate the ECS were now integrated into the hood, and the twin-turbo increased its output to 320 horsepower, as well as switching to a 6-speed manual. The base model Stealth inherited some of the features of the ES trim, resulting in the ES trim being dropped, but it still had the different rear end than the RT and RT twin-turbo models. Due to dropping demand, some of the high-tech features started to be phased out. The tunable exhaust was gone after 1994, the ECS after 1995, and active front and rear spoilers after 1996. Yet despite the drop in demand, Chrysler and Mitsubishi worked together with American Sunroof Corporation, or ASC, to design a retractable hardtop for the 3000 GT, marketing it as the Spider for the 1995 and 96 model years. It was the first retractable hardtop in a production car since the 1959 Ford Fairlane, and since the conversion took place in the US, that's where all of them were sold. Unfortunately, like most retractable hardtops, there was no trunk space when the top was down, and since the car wasn't originally designed to be a convertible, the large trunk lid needed to cover the top wasn't well integrated with the rest of the car. Only 1,034 conversions were ever made, with only 86 of those being made on the twin-turbo VR4 model. Considering the conversion added $20,000 US to the price, which would be around $35,000 today, it's not hard to see why so few were made. The Stealth never got its own version of the Spider convertible, except for this one-off example, which started its life as a Mitsubishi, but after the car was totaled in an accident, the owner chose to rebuild it, for whatever reason, to look like a Dodge Stealth. The fact that Dodge never got its own production version of the convertible was likely due to sales of the Stealth dropping much faster than the 3000 GT. By 1996, sales had dropped to only 1,100 units, resulting in Chrysler pulling the plug that year. With the Daytona having been discontinued a couple years earlier, this left Dodge with the Viper as its only dedicated sports car for several years. The next best options didn't arrive until the mid-2000s, with their Hemi-powered rear-wheel drive wagons, sedans, and coupes. Oh, and that insane 10-cylinder Ram pickup too. Mitsubishi continued selling the 3000 GT, with its sales of 8,300 units that same year, enough to continue exports from Japan. The lowest output V6 base engine, that once only existed in the base Stealth, was now offered in the base 3000 GT. A new basket handle style spoiler was added for 1997, looking not too unlike the spoiler on the Toyota Supra, and by 1999 the spoiler got even larger for the VR4 model. But by that same year, sales had dropped to only 3,400, and with new side impact regulations soon coming due, Mitsubishi had to declare 1999 as the 3000 GT's final model year. A 99 model almost made it into the first Fast and Furious movie, but they needed 4 of them, and none of the 4 cars offered impressed the filmmakers enough to make the cut, resulting in the Eclipse winning the starring role. With such low sales in their final years, finding a Stealth or 3000 GT is rare today, at least in my town, so much so that they often can attract a crowd at car shows. So for any of you that still own one, their rarity may pay off someday, especially if you were fortunate enough to get one with all the cool gadgets that the earlier models had. And of course, if you are fortunate enough to have all those gadgets still work. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.